Today we are going to talk about how the evolutionary forces that affected our ancestors millennia ago can influence our decision-making today. But first, a brief word of caution about evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology is more than just telling a clever story. Simply making an ingenious logical connection between some influence from the Stone Ages and some behavior today is not science. In fact, there's a term that scientists use for these types of clever stories. We call them just so explanations. This is not a term of endearment among scientists. In fact, if one scientist tells another that his or her theory is a just so story, them's fightin' words. The put-down comes from a book of children's fairy tales called Just So Stories, written by Rudyard Kipling. The book related fantastical tales that explained how each animal got its various unique characteristics. Why is the giraffe's neck so long and the rhino's skin so tough? How did the leopard get his spots and the camel his hump? So, for example, Kipling explains that elephants used to have short trunks, until one day an elephant went to take a drink and a crocodile grabbed onto the end of his nose. The elephant tugged and tugged to break free, and by the time he got loose, his short, stumpy snout had been stretched out into a long and slender trunk. Just so. You can see the parallel to evolutionary psychology, as it is misused by amateurs. Please avoid this temptation. These types of just so explanations are almost always non-falsifiable, and as such, not scientific. They're really not very helpful for understanding human decision-making. In this lecture, we are going to discuss examples of good evolutionary psychology, empirically tested, sound theories that make falsifiable predictions and lead to testable hypotheses. So, how have evolutionary forces shaped our decision-making? Well, primarily in two ways. First, the structure of our decision-making apparatus in our minds is a function of the way our minds have evolved over millennia. To return to our metaphor of decision-making as a manufacturing process, evolution forged our decision-making machinery. Or if you like, different types of machinery were tried out in the decision-making workshops of our ancestors. And over time, those pieces of equipment were either accommodated or rejected. So, all of the decision-making machinery that you have to manufacture your choices, including your System 1 and System 2, are the result of evolution. Second, and the focus of today's lecture, evolutionary forces shaped a set of motives and drives that can be activated within each of us and can drive our decision-making even today. Put in the language of our manufacturing metaphor, there were a set of motivational buttons and levers hardwired into our control panels, sometimes deep down, several layers down inside the casing where we can't see them. And sometimes those buttons and levers are activated by what we are seeing or thinking about, without our awareness or conscious control. To put it another way, evolutionary drives might be considered buttons and levers hidden beneath the control panel surface. These motivations can activate and guide our decision-making machinery in ways that might surprise us. Okay, before we get ahead of ourselves, let's back up and have a brief primer on evolution, how it works, and how, in general, it might shape our behavior and decisions. Evolution describes the adaptive changes in a species from generation to generation. These changes are generated and guided by three basic influences. The first, evolutionary influence, is random variation. Each generation produces random genetic differences from the previous generation. Some of these variations will be adaptive, meaning they help the individual in some way that is relevant to survival or procreation. And some of these random variations will be maladaptions, changes that hurt the individual's chances of survival or procreation. And some, of course, won't matter either way. Into this chaos of noisy, random changes come the twin forces of natural and sexual selection. These forces sort people based on genetic fitness and ultimately determine which random variants are adaptive and which are maladaptive. Both selection processes allow an individual's genetic traits to be passed on to future generations. Natural selection, very broadly speaking, refers to the process by which traits that promote survival are passed down from generation to generation. The textbook example of natural selection in action is the peppered moth in 19th century England. Evolutionary changes usually take place very slowly, over many generations, but sometimes radical environmental changes can speed things up. The peppered moth, as its name suggests, has mottled black and white wings. This coloring helped it camouflage itself against the bark of trees, thereby avoiding being eaten by birds. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the dominant form of this moth was light-colored, mostly white wings with a few black speckles. This, as it happened, most closely matched the bark of several tree species in England. But once coal use became ubiquitous, soot darkened the trees, along with everything else. And now, those mostly white wings that had served as such great cover became bright, shining advertisements for predators. And in a remarkably short period of time, naturalists were able to observe a decline in the number of light-winged peppered moths and a parallel climb in the number of dark-winged peppered moths, who were now better able to blend in with the new, darker environment. Natural selection had determined which traits would survive to be passed on to future generations. Sexual selection, of course, refers to those traits passed down genetically that tend to make one more attractive to potential mates, or that enable one to fend off sexual rivals. Many bird species, for example, are characterized by ostentatious plumage, especially among the males, that is used to attract potential mates. This plumage is thought to have been selected over time. Birds with more attractive ornamentation have greater success breeding, thereby passing their genes on to the next generation. From these two broad selective forces, natural selection and sexual selection, we can derive a whole host of specific psychological predictions. In other words, just as evolution created physical adaptation in species, the color of a moth's wings, the style of a bird's plumage, so too these forces may have created psychological adaptations in humans, a predisposition to respond to certain environmental cues in a way that would have increased our ancestors' chances of survival and reproduction. Two prominent psychologists in this area, Douglas Kenrick and Vladas Griškavēģis, have developed a framework of 7 evolutionary goals that can affect individual decision-making. And they've tied each of these goals to an associated sub-self. Here are the 7 basic evolutionary goals: self-protection, disease avoidance, affiliation, status, mate acquisition, mate retention, and kin care. 2 of these goals tied directly back to natural selection, that is, to survival. Self-protection and disease avoidance both help to ensure that you live long enough to mate and pass your genes along to future generations. 3 of those goals are tied directly to sexual selection, that is, producing offspring and ensuring the survival of that offspring. Those goals are mate acquisition, mate retention, and kin care. Now, kin care may not sound like a goal that would be shaped by the forces of sexual selection. But remember that sexual selection is about more than just successfully attracting a mate. In order for your ancestors' genes to have been passed down to you, they had to have produced offspring that also survived long enough to reproduce themselves. And given the massive amount of effort required to keep a human baby alive and to rear it to adulthood, sexual selection also shaped our decision-making regarding caring for that offspring. The remaining 2 goals, affiliation and status, are arguably driven by both natural and sexual selection. The goal to affiliate encourages us to get along with others and to work in groups. For our prehistorical ancestors, working in groups increase the chances of survival and getting along, also generally improve the chances of our offspring surviving and prospering. The same with status. High-status individuals are more likely to have increased mating opportunities, and they're also more likely to survive and have children that survive than are low-status individuals. The idea behind this framework is that whatever else we have going on in our day, we have these 7 latent goals waiting below the surface. These goals have been so important to our ancestors for so many hundreds of thousands of years in shaping their behavior that they are essentially hardwired into our minds. And in innumerable subtle ways, every day, our environments can activate these goal states, bring them to the surface to influence our behavior. In other words, even if we aren't aware of it, these core evolutionary goals can play a part in some of the most mundane and some of the most important decisions that we make in our lives. Kenrick and Grishkevicius explain that the activation and interplay of our 7 latent goals in terms of different aspects of the self. We all have within us different aspects. So, for example, you might have a student self, and a parent self, and a manager self. Different sides of your self-concept that are activated at different times in response to the environment that you are in. The drinking buddy self will likely react to the same stimulus, say a bawdy joke, very differently than would the parent self. This idea of multiple aspects of the self can be used to explain how these multiple evolutionary goals can coexist within us all at the same time. Just like you are not in parent mode all the time, so are you not in mate acquisition mode all the time. Unless, of course, you're a 17-year-old male, in which case you pretty much are. These different subselves are not multiple personalities. They are all you, just different sides of you. And the environment you are in often determines which side is facing the world and making decisions. All right, that was pretty abstract. Let's get into some specifics. And in passing, let me recommend the Kenrick and Grishkevicius book, Rational Animal, which is a great resource for building upon the foundation I will lay today. Let me give you some specific examples. When testing the affiliation goal, psychologists derive the prediction that social rejection is likely to activate the goal to affiliate with others. So, while we all always have the goal to affiliate somewhere within us, it is often latent, not acting as the primary driver of our behavior or decisions. But sometimes, such as when we feel socially rejected, that goal becomes activated and starts to influence us. And the researchers further predicted that when the affiliation subself was active, then people will tend to be more accommodating in their evaluations of other people. Think of it this way. If you are at a party, you have a series of decisions to make with regards to your social interaction. Are you going to approach someone and introduce yourself? If yes, then which person? These decisions can be influenced in part by that latent evolutionary goal to affiliate. If you have a strong need to affiliate, you might start to see people as more friendly, more approachable. In other words, more likely to be someone worth affiliating with. That was the hypothesis anyway. To test this prediction, these researchers had participants interact first in a large group, just mingling, making small talk, under the guise that they were involved in a study examining group dynamics. Next, everyone was placed in their own individual small room to wait while the researchers ostensibly formed small groups. Everyone was told, "We're interested in forming groups in which members like and respect each other. Below, please name 2 people out of those that you met today that you would most like to work with." So everyone in their own small rooms wrote down 2 names and then waited while the researchers formed up the groups. A few minutes later, a researcher came back to the room and said that unfortunately they couldn't go forward with the small group exercise like they had planned. Participants were given one of 2 reasons for the change. In the high social acceptance condition, people were told, "We couldn't form the groups because everyone selected you to be in their group." Essentially, people were told that their extreme popularity broke the experiment. You are beautiful and popular, and everyone loves you. People randomly assigned to the low social acceptance condition got a very different message. They were told, we couldn't form the groups as usual because no one selected you to be in their group. Basically, they were told that their every fear from junior high school had just been realized, and that no one loved them and they would likely die alone, surrounded by cats. So that was the manipulation. Make people feel either very socially accepted or not socially accepted, with the assumption that social rejection would activate that affiliation subself. People were then given a separate task in which they were asked to rate the sociability of a series of faces. These faces were pre-tested to be of moderate attractiveness and to have neutral expression, neither happy nor sad. And people in the high social acceptance condition, those who were told they were extremely popular, did indeed rate those faces as neutral. The average ratings came in right at about 4 on a series of 7-point scales, measuring how nice, friendly, attractive, and desirable those faces were. But among those who had first been socially rejected, they saw these neutral faces as significantly nicer and friendlier and more attractive and more desirable. It is as if being rejected activates the goal to affiliate, and that goal drives us to look for any opportunity, any social opening to approach others and bond with them. Maybe that's not a neutral expression that person is giving me. Maybe that's actually a mildly positive expression. Maybe that half smile is really a full smile. Maybe. Maybe that's an invitation to talk to them. Maybe. And perceptions of sociability matter because they affect decisions about how we will interact with other people. Presumably, this change in perceptions of sociability would lead to difference in decisions about whether or not to strike up a conversation with a stranger on a bus, or whether or not to approach them at a social function. When our affiliation subself is active, our decisions will bend in the direction of connecting with other people and strengthening social bonds. So, one key to this approach to evolutionary psychology is that various environmental factors can activate these deep-seated goals, which can, in turn, influence our subsequent evaluations, behaviors, and decisions. Here's another example. This time where 2 evolutionary goal states, self-protection and mate acquisition, were pitted against each other. The decision of whether to conform or to diverge from the group can be driven by a variety of factors. And at various points in time, all of us will feel the pull to do both. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, the goal of affiliation will clearly lead to conformity. That's one clear strategy for getting along with the group, conforming with their preferences and behaviors. But affiliation is not the only evolutionary goal that will lead to conformity. Self-protection is another goal that will tend to drive conformity. When we are in danger, it is always better to be surrounded by other people rather than be alone. Just ask anyone in a horror movie. In contrast, divergence from the group tends to be a preferred strategy when the mate acquisition goal is active. If you are trying to attract a mate, you don't want to blend into the background. You want to stand out, be unique and differentiated. Give that other person a reason for choosing you. So, some researchers tested these conflicting paths towards conformity and uniqueness by first activating an evolutionary goal state. And they did this by having people watch one of 2 movie clips. In the mate acquisition condition, people watched a few minutes from the movie before sunset. This is an extremely romantic depiction of 2 extremely attractive people falling in love against the extremely beautiful backdrop of old European cities. If this movie doesn't make you want to fall in love, then you are dead inside. In the self-protection condition, people saw a clip from The Shining. Specifically, the scene in which Jack Nicholson tries to smash through a locked door with an axe so he can murder his family. Terrifying. After watching one of these film clips, participants were asked to participate in an ostensibly unrelated study in which they evaluated a number of proposed ads for various products. People saw one of 2 versions of each ad. One relied on a popularity appeal. emphasizing features like fastest growing, or over 1 million sold, or most popular. The other version of each ad used a uniqueness appeal, with copy that included phrases like limited edition, one of a kind, and think different. For example, one of the ads was for the city of Las Vegas. Both versions showed a picture of the Strip at night, with all the lights flashing. But in one condition, the tagline was, Las Vegas, visited by 30 million each year. And in the other condition, it was, Las Vegas, stand out from the crowd. Consistently, people who were in the self-protection condition, those who had just watched The Shining, rated the popularity appeals higher, while those in the mate acquisition condition, those who saw the romantic movie, responded more favorably to the ads with the uniqueness appeal. If you are trying to attract a mate, that uniqueness appeal fits the bill. But if you are thinking about being chased down by a maniac with an axe, well then being surrounded by 30 million of your closest friends seems better. This matters because the decisions you make with regard to which books to read, which blender to buy, where to go on vacation, these will depend in part on how persuasive you find their advertising and associated appeals. And how persuasive you find those appeals will be a function of which subself happens to be activated. Of the research done into the various ways evolutionary goals can influence behavior, the mate acquisition goal seems to have gotten the most attention. And in my opinion, that is likely at least partially driven by the fact that it is such a fun area to do research in. The growing consensus of this body of work is that one major mediator of our mate acquisition behavior is changes in the associated sex hormones. And this means that men and women tend to behave very differently when this goal state is activated. The male response tends to be relatively easily activated by environmental cues. This is partly due to the fact that testosterone levels are very responsive to the situation one finds oneself in. Recent research has found, for example, that holding a gun or driving a sports car can cause testosterone levels to spike. And when testosterone levels go up as a result of mate acquisition goal, men tend to be more non-conforming, as we've already seen. They also tend to engage in more conspicuous consumption, becoming more gain-seeking and more creative, and also becoming more risk-seeking. In one novel study, researchers Richard Rene and William von Hippel studied the behavior of teenagers at a skate park. They watched them for a while and had experts rate the difficulty of the tricks they were trying. They then had a confederate, an attractive young woman, enter the skate park just to watch. Suddenly, the tricks got flashier and more dangerous. By taking saliva samples from some of the young men, the researchers were able to confirm that there was an increase in testosterone levels that happened when the pretty girl showed up, and that led to this increase in risky stunts. So, when the mate acquisition goal kicks in, men tend to make riskier decisions. I know, stop the presses. For women, mate acquisition goals tend to be less situational and more cyclical. The hormones that drive female mate acquisition behaviors tend to be less influenced by the immediate environment, but driven more by the ovulatory cycle. In one study led by Cristina Durante, undergraduates were asked to give a urine sample from which it was later determined which participants were ovulating during the experiment. All participants were asked to participate in an online shopping task, where they could pick their favorites among a wide variety of clothing, shoes, and accessories. When the researchers looked at their participants' clothing preferences and correlated those with hormone levels, they found their participants were more attracted to clothing and accessories that were independently rated as being sexier and more alluring when they were ovulating. In short, the underlying goal state was subtly influenced by the kind of choices they might have made on a shopping excursion. And a similar study found that the ovulatory cycle affects not just what types of clothing women might choose when shopping, but also what clothes they actually decided to wear on campus on the day of the study. By snapping pictures of participants and coding the types of clothing worn, researchers were able to document that, sure enough, more alluring clothing was chosen during ovulation. The status subself can also drive a lot of decision-making. Status needs can be activated either through threat or through aspiration. Feeling somehow slighted and wondering about one's perceived pecking order can activate a status goal. So can reading an inspirational story about a leader, some great man or woman that makes us want to strive and also win the admiration of others. Status goals, like mate acquisition goals, can lead to ostentatious displays. Conspicuous consumption can often take the form of the decision to buy expensive or exclusive items. If I were to ask you to list off high-status items, you might list some of the largely unattainable items that only the rich and powerful can afford. Rolex watches, personal yachts, sports cars, penthouse suites, the Birkin bag. But there's more than one way to be conspicuous. Sometimes status can be gained by conspicuously consuming a virtuous product, even if it's not exclusive or expensive. Nowhere has this phenomenon been displayed in starker relief than at the Academy Awards. For a number of years in the early 2000s, there were two conflicting status signals sent out by the stars who walked the red carpet. As they were chauffeured to the curb, these famous actors and directors chose as their chariots either classical status in the form of stretched limousines or decked out Hummers, or they chose virtuous status in the form of the humble Toyota Prius hybrid. Some of these stars chose to uncomfortably unfold themselves from the back seats of cars that likely cost less than the gowns they were wearing. But the hybrids, especially when they were new and exotic, were a strong signal of the celebrity's commitment to environmental causes. It was proof of virtue, and as such, it was a status symbol. To test this idea that virtuous decisions could serve as a status need, Grishkaviches and colleagues ran a study in which they asked participants to choose between two cars. Both were $30,000 Honda Accords, but one was the fully loaded EXL model with a V6 and leather seats and all the bells and whistles. The other was the hybrid model, not nearly as fancy, but it did have a logo on the back announcing to all that it was a fuel-efficient hybrid model, so it had that going for it. Before making their choice, half of the participants read a vignette designed to activate the status subself. This was the story of a person on their first day at a prestigious job, just finding out that they would be competing with several others for the prize of getting a coveted corner office. And sure enough, those with the activated status goal were more likely to choose the less luxurious hybrid model. If you can't afford the Lexus, maybe flaunting your green cred is a reasonable alternative as a means of acquiring status. A follow-up study confirmed that a status goal increased environmentally friendly decisions only when the environmentally friendly decisions were conspicuous. If you were being virtuous in silence, where no one could observe you, well, that can't boost your status, can it? So why would you bother? So, what to make of all of this? In an earlier lecture, we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs as one framework for categorizing the various motivations that drive people's decision-making. Consider evolutionary psychology and the 7 subselves framework in particular to be another approach for trying to organize the chaotic tangle of motivations that drive human decision-making. Where most of Maslow's goals might be considered conscious goals, things that people are aware they are striving towards, most of the evolutionary goals that we've been talking about might be considered non-conscious. Often, we are not aware that these evolutionary goal states have been activated in us by some factor in our environment or by some factor within our own bodies. If we return to our metaphor of the control panel, we can think of evolutionary drives as buttons and levers hidden beneath the control panel's surface, built into the panel's inner workings. These motivations can activate and guide our decision-making machinery in ways that we may not be aware of. These surprise motivations can be helpful or distracting, but even if they are not always well suited to the everyday decisions that we make today, they served our ancestors well enough for those traits to be passed down to us. So I guess we'll just have to make the best of them.